Valiant, please take the floor.
Thanks very much, and I really appreciate the invitation to come and speak with you all today. It sounds like you have participated in several of these webinars, but this is my first, and it's great to be part of it. It's also a pleasure to talk about this important topic of demand. And indeed, I think as the title of this webinar suggests, the demand is really about all of us. And confronting demand means removing us and our money from the marketplace that fosters human trafficking. I don't know if the audience of this webinar appreciate just how rare and wonderful it is to listen to Brian and Inga talk like that, because as Brian said at the beginning, the global conversation around trafficking very often does not address demand. And so it's really unusual for me to sit in a webinar and actually hear others discussing a topic that I feel we've been raising over and over again. About 20 years ago, as Brian said, in 2000, the Palermo Protocol provided us with the first international definition of trafficking, and it outlined the three pillars of our response that Brian talked a little bit about: protection, prosecution, and prevention. But unfortunately, about 2 decades later, trafficking is worse than ever, Michel, as you said, opening this conversation. And no country has defeated it. In fact, it's increasingly embedded in our economies, our societies, and continues growing, fueled by online platforms, especially in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic. This is not to say, however, that I don't think winning the battle against trafficking and exploitation is not possible. I absolutely believe it is. But in order to do so, we need to confront the real source of the problem, which has too often remained invisible and outside the scope of states' anti-trafficking efforts. So I believe that effectively confronting trafficking today really means addressing its root cause, its true root cause, which is demand. Why? Well, trafficking is, for the most part, a financially motivated crime. Traffickers exploit their victims to make money. And so, like Brian said earlier, while poverty and injustice might make it easier for traffickers to ensnare victims, that's not what's motivating the crime. What causes it is the $150 billion a year that traffickers can make off exploitation. The $150 billion that individuals, businesses, or governments even are knowingly or unknowingly paying for goods or services that are extracted from trafficking victims. Thus, the importance of the demand side interventions is twofold. First, as a means of undermining the financial motivations of the crime, and second, it helps counter the physical and psychological harm suffered by trafficking victims. In fact, if demand is the financial catalyst of traffickers, buyers, by motivating traffickers to traffic, buyers are responsible for the coercion that's inflicted onto trafficking victims. Addressing demand is also the right approach to confront the scale of exploitation in our society. Brian spoke really eloquently, I think, about how a law enforcement only response is never going to be enough. It's never going to be able to respond to the scale. The size of the problem is such that there just aren't enough police officers to defeat the crime with traditional law enforcement tools. To put it differently, as a trafficking survivor, Rachel Moran, once said, how do you expect to uproot a tree if all you're doing is ripping at the leaves? And I think that captures the challenge before us very well. If we want to eradicate human trafficking, we need to target its roots. So what do I mean by demand, and how exactly do we go about doing this? Well, first, I think it's necessary to understand that demand manifests slightly differently depending on the form of exploitation, for example, forced labor or sexual exploitation. Trafficking for forced labor, and so it's been really nice listening, because we had a presentation on forced labor and now a presentation around sexual exploitation. It's really nice to hear those sides, and I'm going to try to bring those together a little bit. Forced labor infiltrated into the legal economy to the point that victims are trafficked in sectors that are part of our daily life. Textile manufacturing, construction, food production, whatever. Demand here references the desire to purchase as an intermediate or as an end user goods or services that could be met through forced or exploited labor. Oftentimes, the purchasers won't be aware of the presence of exploitation, but they are still fueling it. And this is one of the great myths about addressing demand, that we need to talk about the demand for trafficking. There's very little demand for trafficking. There's demand for goods and services that can be met with trafficking victims. Discouraging the demand that fosters trafficking for forced labor thus requires states to enact laws and regulations that prevent the purchase, either through public procurement or private companies, of goods and services produced by or extracted from trafficking victims. When it comes to trafficking for the purpose of sexual exploitation, the idea is similar, not paying for trafficking, right? How do we set up policies that make sure that we don't pay for exploitation? Here, demand that fuels trafficking is once again not the demand for trafficking, but rather the demand for paid sex. Men typically do not seek to buy sex from trafficking victims, but rather seek to buy sex, and trafficking victims are what they are provided. Once again, as Rachel Moran once said, they don't know and they don't care. Now, I think Inga had some great quotes that suggest some know more than they might like to admit, but in large part, they are willing to buy whatever they can, and oftentimes trafficking victims are what they are given. And this has a clear gender component. We're talking about a demand overwhelmingly created by men, whose price is disproportionately paid by women and girls. Not only, but disproportionately paid by women and girls. Men who pay for sex from trafficking victims not only are and create the demand, they also form part of the trafficking chain and are inflictors of harm upon victims through engaging in acts akin to rape. And this is really an important point, I think, as Inga talked about the phrase sex buyers, and some of the comments in the chat referred to this as well. I think it's really important to note that men who buy sex from trafficking victims are not only fueling exploitation, but engaging in exploitation. Is by definition somebody who did not come to this transaction voluntarily, if there is such a thing in this industry. It's somebody who by definition came through coercion or force or other means, and therefore it's non-consensual sex, and it's an exploitative act on its own. And I think this is crucial to take account of. So let me give you two concrete examples, one on labor, one on sex. First of all, during the pandemic, there was a tremendous demand for medical gloves. Obviously, governments needed to respond to the pandemic, and they needed billions of gloves from major companies, major producers around the world, including at least two large companies named Supermax and Top Glove, who were using forced labor. Interestingly enough, and this shows the power of demand, indiscriminate demand, if you will, governments, in their efforts to respond to a public health problem, were inadvertently fueling trafficking and forced labor by buying from companies that were using this forced labor. Whether they knew or not is not entirely the point. The point is that they were buying and they were fueling exploitation as a result of it. Likewise, another example is the war and subsequent humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. Since the start of the war, we worked with a technology company to follow online traffic, and we discovered that global online searches for explicit content and sexual services from Ukrainian women and girls have increased dramatically. Staggeringly, global searches for Ukrainian pornography grew by 600%, searches for Ukrainian escorts by 200%. This was across multiple countries and multiple languages. This data illuminates a spiking demand for sexual access to Ukrainian women and girls, a demand that is quite frankly not at all concerned about vulnerability, as Inga's quotes just showed. Inga, I prosecuted a man several years ago who said to his friends, and I'm going to use a quote as you did, "War is great for the sex trade." That was how he viewed the tremendous vulnerability that results from conflict. And we might view the conflict as a great tragedy, but he viewed it as an opportunity, and I think that's entirely consistent with the quotes you shared with us earlier. Once again, I remind you of Rachel Moran's quote, "They don't know and they don't care." This once again shows the crises provide fertile ground for human trafficking, making our work especially urgent. So let me describe a little bit about what the OSC is trying to do to address this. In combating the demand that fosters trafficking for forced labor, we are supporting states in adopting policies and laws that establish protective measures, foster transparency and due diligence in supply chains. Those are a lot of complicated words. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that we need laws and policies that states can require companies to make sure that they are not buying goods and services from trafficking victims, right? It's just that simple. If we want to stop trafficking, we got to stop paying for it. And so we produce model guidelines, a model law, and a compendium of resources for states to actually adopt those provisions. We're now working on spreading those materials and raising awareness about how to implement them and what the options are for countries through workshops across various countries in the OSCE region. It's actually quite surprising how new these concepts are for so many countries. They sound reasonable, they sound obvious, yet as Brian said, the last 20 years of anti-trafficking work has not emphasized this approach. We're also working inside the OSCE ourselves. We really believe we need to lead by example on this. International organizations are fantastic at pointing the finger at countries to do more, but not so good at doing their own work. And so what we decided to do was try to address that ourselves. We led the way by adopting measures internally on our own procurement processes to make sure that we're not buying goods and services from trafficking victims. And now we're supporting other international organizations in doing the same, including through the UN by co-chairing a task force with ILO on how to make sure that the UN can adopt these same principles. Parallel to this work on trafficking for labor exploitation, we're doing a lot on the topic of trafficking for sexual exploitation. Last year, we produced a groundbreaking paper on discouraging the demand that fosters trafficking for purposes of sexual exploitation. And the paper provided the most comprehensive overview of states' international obligations to discourage demand that fosters sexual exploitation and offers recommendations to countries. Stunningly, in 2000, the Palermo Protocol established a legal obligation for all countries to address demand, all forms of demand, and it's mandatory. And in those 20 years, nobody has produced a comprehensive paper on how to discourage the demand that fosters trafficking for sexual exploitation. This is really quite amazing. So we wrote the paper, and we've now shared it with you all. And it's really important for countries to start doing this. If any country, and there's 185 of them that signed up to the Palermo Protocol, if any country signed that convention, they're obligated to start working on demand. So it's time to get started. As mentioned before, trafficking for sexual exploitation is increasingly an online phenomenon, and it's impossible to have a discussion about trafficking today without factoring in the role of technology. So we also produced a policy paper outlining how laws and policies can try to prevent technology-facilitated trafficking. Again, this is a huge topic right now in the European Union as they try to figure out how to make the online environment more safe. And all of those websites that Inga was talking about earlier, the hobby boards, the John boards, the sexual service websites, none of them have prevention measures in place to make sure that they're not selling children, that they're not selling exploited adults. There is nothing. They claim to have moderators. They don't. We know this because we've worked on numerous cases involving these sites. Over and over again, children and exploited people are found on those sites. What we'd like to do is make sure now that states have the policy options in front of them and can adopt the laws that they need. Finally, last year, we held our flagship conference called the Alliance Conference on the topic of demand. The first such conference, to my knowledge, held by an international organization entirely devoted to the topic of addressing demand. And we put the report from that conference also in the chat so you can take a look at it. So this is where we are at right now, and what we are trying to do is where do we go from here? Try to figure out what to do next. Well, first of all, I think we really need states to implement their international legal obligations. This needs attention, and they have a bunch of resources they can take from the papers that we've produced and other papers as well. there's been a lot of action on preventing trafficking for forced labor by addressing the demand side. There's been almost none comparatively on the sexual exploitation side. Some countries are adopting the equality model, which is a positive trend, but others are doing absolutely nothing. In our study of discouraging demand, we identified that of the 57 OSCE countries, 20 had zero identifiable initiatives at all on addressing the demand that fosters trafficking for sexual exploitation. That means they are not meeting their international legal obligations. Which brings me to my final point. The major challenge right now remains the need for political will to address these problems, granting the necessary resources for all government intervention, but also making sure that we fund all of the other programs that need attention, protection and assistance for victims and so forth. But it also means investing in prevention, commensurate to the scale of the problem, and in policy reform. So it's time for states to move beyond general awareness campaigns and really start to invest in deterrence and disruption in early childhood education. Why are we teaching so many girls to not get trafficked, but we're not teaching boys to stop exploiting girls? This is amazing to me that we are still in this position now. There needs to be a serious attention in schools on gender equality, on consent, on behaviors that the underlying behaviors that are part of those quotes that Inga read to you earlier. Let me conclude with this. The current situation is challenging, and human trafficking is increasingly intertwined with the fabric of our societies and our economies. But I also see a new attention, a new willingness to address this topic of demand. The fact that this webinar itself is on demand tells you something, right? The conversation is increasing, and more we're turning on how to address the root causes. So if we want to move from the topic of combating human trafficking to actually ending it, the time is now to start talking about addressing demand in a really holistic and comprehensive way. So thanks so much for the opportunity again to join you all today.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Valiant, for your very clear explanations. And I think indeed you have an assistant who is giving us the references of many interesting OSCE reports, and definitely we'll keep them also in the handouts.
There was a question here, and Valiant, maybe you want to start with this one. There's this question about the equality model. How could it be improved? Are there additional laws or measures that could be applied to make the equalities model even more successful?
Well, one of the things that we have seen in all countries, including those that have adopted the equality model and those that have not, is inadequate attention to the online aspects of it. And here you need a different set of laws that relate to the websites where these things are happening. These websites exist in every country, regardless of their legalization of prostitution or not. In the US, for example, prostitution, selling and buying is criminalized almost everywhere, and there are thousands of websites. And that it's like that in many places. So the reason I'm emphasizing this is that it is important to address the sort of social norms of these things, to address harmful conduct, to address behavior that is it rises to the level of criminal activity or sexual violence. But it's also important to address and to dismantle the infrastructure that is facilitating all of this. And the online platforms, the sexual service websites, the pornography platforms that where people are trafficked for forced pornography or other locations need to be dismantled, or prevention measures need to be applied to make sure that these platforms are not facilitating and making this whole exploitative industry much more efficient. It's like operating a bookstore versus operating Amazon, right? The difference between the speed and efficiency and scale of the online market is so tremendous that if you don't dismantle that infrastructure, you're going to have a very, very hard time combating it. And so I think there's a number of things I could say in this, but that would be the number one thing that I think needs to go alongside of the policies around buying and selling of sex, or around traffickers and how they should be punished.
So, Valiant, would you have a comment on perhaps at the institutional level what we could be doing about this to tackle this obvious connection between these two things?
Well, first of all, I'll say that a lot of what Inga said has been my experience as well. I think that when we talk to survivors, they often talk about not only being raped, but having it filmed. And then that's shared and perpetuated, which for many of them creates a compounding harm over time, because those videos get uploaded online, and then it's the trauma of knowing that it's out there, right? On the other hand, as Inga said, we've also, when I was a prosecutor, we heard from many men that they had started with pornography and then moved to actually acting on it. And over time, their interests got more in younger girls and younger. And so it did certainly seem, it's hard for me to articulate it as a cause and effect, but it was certainly a very disturbing correlation. And so that's really problematic. At an institutional level, it's difficult because pornography in many countries is protected speech. But what I think is not been appreciated in those analyses is the extent to which it is exploitative or violent or criminal. And free speech does not protect criminal activity. And so what needs to be put into place are better protections, I think, at the policy level on how that happens, including, as I said before, what is uploaded, what is shown on video sites, to better restrict the exploitative nature of this. Let me give you a very quick example. A lot of countries are exploring age verification technology right now to try to prevent children from viewing pornography on websites. This is a worthy goal and something that should be considered, so that we aren't building another generation of people demanding, violent acts from their partners or from people in prostitution. But oftentimes what is not happening in those policy discussions is age verification of the people depicted in pornography. So there is no protection that the people being shown are not minors, for example. They're putting into place policies to make sure that children aren't watching it, but they're not making policies put in place to make sure children aren't in it. And that is a real problem in policy responses and needs to be fixed. I know that I've spoken a lot about tech, but I cannot overemphasize the extent to which technology has exploded this problem to a scale that is very hard to imagine. I'm going to need to go in a second, so if I could take one quick sentence and respond to this question from Janet Palafox about how consumers can make informed decisions. And Brian, I bet you have some things to say on this as well. There are a lot of websites out there that can help inform consumers about whether the items they're buying were produced with slave labor. And I'm sure Brian can elaborate on those. But I wanted to highlight this because it emphasizes the difference between trafficking for labor exploitation and trafficking for sexual exploitation. Trafficking for sexual exploitation, the victim and the end user are in close and intimate and direct contact with each other, which highlights the need for intervention with that end user, either deterrence or criminal action or whatever. With labor exploitation, I could be 6 or 10 or 100 steps removed from the child that made my shoes, for example. And so it's much more difficult for end users to know specific information about that. Not impossible, as I'm sure Brian will explain in a minute, But what that highlights is that our policy interventions need to take place at a whole bunch of points along the way between the end user and the victim. And this means in the first supplier, the second sub-supplier, the third, and down through the supply chain to make sure that we have protections all the way through so that at no point exploited goods and services get in there. That's not a super satisfying answer for those who are wanting to not buy goods made with exploited labor, but there are also some other options there. I just wanted to add that in because I have to leave the conversation. But thanks everybody so much for, and Michelle, thanks for raising this really crucial topic. I so appreciate it. Thanks also to Brian and Inga. It was great to listen to you both.
Thanks, Valiant. Likewise. Good to see you.